sweep over the one side for a little shadow and then the other side for a highlight. Hello, welcome to part 3 of my Margo devlog / postmortem series. If you don't know what Margo is, it's a game that I made. It's available for free on Steam or itch.io. I made it with my partner Upside Yonder. Today I'm going to focus on the digital art side. I'm just going to kind of like share my process. I have some tips that I find useful. I'm going to be talking mostly in terms of Procreate because that's the software that I use, but I'm sure that most of this applies to like all digital art. So I came to digital art from like drawing and painting, like physical art. I had a Wacom bamboo tablet like a long time ago, but I don't think I gave it enough of a chance. I couldn't get used to like not being able to see my hand, and then I also think like the software was kind of overwhelming at the time. I didn't start doing digital art till like years later. I started using like an old iPad. It was so old that it couldn't use Apple Pencil, and so I was just using like a stylus on it, which worked, but I wasn't able to get certain stuff like pressure sensitivity, and just in general it was like kind of laggy. But I did manage to make like a couple animated music videos with it. It was totally like good for that kind of thing. I used Procreate and Adobe Express, which I didn't end up liking that workflow. This is a side note, I guess, but I don't use Adobe Express anymore. I use like either DaVinci or like CapCut anyway. And so at this time, like I was kind of playing around with like this watercolor effect for digital, and I was using just like a bunch of adjustment layers that I found like this technique online, kind of simulating watercolor, because I really liked working with watercolor physically. And so I think that like now that I'm thinking back to that, before I started getting into watercolor, I was just using like simple lines and fill. I found that it started to get really kind of like uninspiring. I wasn't really sure like what direction to go in to like kind of get out of that. There was something that I really missed about physical art. There's kind of this like feeling, kind of is like more of like a body thing. I'm sure anyone who draws like understands that feeling. But I felt like I was kind of being removed from it since it was just like a screen and you could undo any brushstroke that you made. I think that going towards watercolor kind of like allowed for like more of like the looseness. After working with that complicated workflow of the watercolor, I was just like, okay, I need to go back to like, you know, just lines and fill. I just wanted to just be simple. So I started leaning towards more of like a cartoony style and trying to figure out like why I wasn't comfortable with my lines. Then I finally got to upgrade to an iPad Pro. It just felt way more real because like I could get like pressure sensitivity. There was like no lag, like it was so smooth. But then at the same time, since now I can have, you know, so many layers, I can have like so many different kinds of brushes that like would work with the pressure sensitivity, and like I could really kind of like do any kind of art style that I wanted to. I was like, okay, I feel like I need to narrow things down and figure out what I wanted to do stylistically. So I was like, okay, how do I get that feeling back that I liked from analog drawing? So I started just like sketching again, like with pencil and paper, and I feel like that really helped. It was almost like a cleanse or something. I really started paying attention to like the lines that I put down instead of just kind of like doing whatever and then undoing and like trying to do like a perfect line over and over again. The thing that I was missing, the step that I was skipping the whole time, was sketching, which I know that like digital artists, that's what they do. They'll like sketch something out with like no smoothing or anything just to like actually get a feel for what it is that they're drawing. And for some reason I would just like take a pen with like a bunch of like smoothing and I would skip the sketching step. That's like the long way that I learned that lesson, to sketch out things before I ink them. I find that it really helps, especially for creativity. When you're sketching something and you know the lines are kind of vague, you can kind of like see more options and more ideas about whatever it is you're drawing, especially for animation. In terms of like style, like I liked the like drippy eyes that I was doing. I feel like at first glance people are kind of like confused, like they're like, why are her eyes like that, like where are her pupils? But I think that it's kind of good to have something that maybe like throws people off a little bit. The main thing is like keeping everything consistent. When you have rules set in place about like what kind of eyes you do and like what your lines are like, it makes it easier for like things to look cohesive. So another learning curve for me was color, like dealing with digital color. I expected it to be like, I was like, oh yeah, I have like a basic grasp of like color theory and, you know, how to mix paints, but it's way different than that. At first, like my color palettes were desaturated, and so it took me a while to like gain confidence in terms of like saturation and making colors from scratch. Something that really helped me with that is pixel art color theory, because pixel art is like so minimalist. They have like a lot of like rules, just guidelines I guess, and there's lots of resources for that stuff online. I found it really satisfying to learn that way. In pixel art, a color palette is called a color ramp. Basically, you're taking every color that you absolutely need, you're kind of like bridging them together, and then they kind of like branch off and, you know, go into like different colors. And the whole point is like, how do you make the most condensed color ramp where you're using like every single color and you don't have any colors that you don't need. And I like that. Sometimes putting rules on things helps organize things in my mind, and then I don't feel like there's too much like options. So I would spend forever like just, you know, picking colors that I liked and then trying to like bridge them into other colors. It's kind of like a little puzzle. It became kind of like a little thing that I would do, and I think through doing that it really helped me kind of like understand how to make digital colors. I found like a little trick to shading and highlighting using adjustment layers and clipping mask instead of like manually picking a shade. So in Procreate, what I use is a layer for lines, and then a layer as an adjustment layer, and then a layer for fill. I do my lines, and then I'll do my fill using a reference from my lines layer, and then I'll have an adjustment layer between them that's set as a clipping mask so that it only affects the fill layer. And then I'll use like shading tones, I guess. So like I'll use a really dark blue because we tend to see shadows as like cool. And then I'll do like a really light yellow because we tend to see highlights as more yellow. And then I also have colors in between just because they affect different colors in different ways. And then I can kind of just like take a big brush and just like sweep over the one side for a little shadow and then the other side for a highlight, and it's like really fast and easy. Anyways, that's I guess like a little technique that I use. So in terms of like Margo and in terms of like making a game, some of the things that I had to think about was the line width. At first I started out with a pretty thin line width because we wanted to release Margo as like HTML5, which is playable on desktop and mobile. The thinner the line, the harder it was to see things on mobile. So I increased the line width. It's really interesting how line width affects like drawing. I found that almost like the thicker the line, like the cuter things tend to look. Whereas with thinner lines, it tends to feel more serious, I think because there's more room for detail. Obviously there's like a lot of variation with this and like there's no rule about it or anything like that. Also in terms of like bringing things into the engine, in Engine I noticed that I didn't like the look of stuff when I scaled things. Like there would be multiple different layers, and so it would be like the background, and then it would be like the furniture, the stuff that was placed on top of the furniture, characters, and then what was in front of the characters. Since we had all these layers, if I wanted something to be a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger, I could have just scaled it in Engine, but I didn't like doing that because it increased the line width, and so there'd be something with like, you know, way thicker lines than another thing. I didn't like the way that looked. I wanted it to look more like it was drawn all at once. So if I decided something was too small or too big, then I needed to redraw the sprite. Overall, the stuff that I like the most about making the art for Margo is like designing the scenes was really fun. Making the backgrounds, it really kind of felt like I was kind of like watching the world kind of unfold as I was drawing it, and it kind of felt like I was exploring. It felt very inventive. And I also loved like drawing the animal characters when I was designing the raven character. And the next day I went for like a walk in the park, and then there was like this huge thing in the tree, and I was like, what is that like big thing? And it was making these sounds that were like really like low, kind of like guttural sounds, but like really pretty. I whipped my phone out because I wanted to get a picture of it because like my parents really like birds. I wanted to ask them what it was. And so I whipped my phone out, but then she was like, and then she flew away. It was definitely a raven. I don't know, it just felt really special. And then every time I went for a walk, I'd be like, but I never saw one. Just crows. And so when I was trying to get like an audio sample for like the voice for the raven, I had to use a crow. I respect crows too, because crows are also beautiful. Thanks for watching! Let me know your thoughts. I love talking about like the art process, and I love hearing other people's processes. If you liked this video, if you watched it to this point, then give it a thumbs up, or else subscribe. In the next one, I'm going to be talking about music and sound effects.